I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What on earth are we here for? Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Even the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. They're worth more than many sparrows. Perhaps you remember the hit song. What's it all about, Alfie? Is it just for the moment we live? Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are on a camping trip. In the middle of the night, Holmes nudges Watson awake and says, "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." "I see millions of stars, my dear Holmes." "And what do you infer from seeing these stars?" "Well, a number of things," he says, getting out his pipe and lighting it. "Astronomically, I believe there are millions of galaxies and billions of stars and planets. Theologically, I see that God is all-powerful and man, his creation, small and insignificant. What about you, Holmes?" "Watson, you fool! Somebody has stolen our tent." You know, it would not be hard to agree with Watson's theology that human beings, compared to the size of the universe, are small and insignificant, would it? However, Jesus would disagree, for Jesus argued that every hair on our head is numbered. God sees each sparrow fall, that we are each precious to God. And even though space is incredibly vast, the tiny microbes and viruses play a very significant role. And even though space is incredibly vast, it's not vast enough to make it impossible for tiny, tiny, tiny things to also exist. According to the psalmist, God knows whether you're sitting down or standing, walking or lying down. God knows every detail of our conduct. That's kind of sobering, isn't it? Especially when we're not being particularly kind. The psalmist argues that no matter where we go, God is there. God is aware, we believe, in a loving sense, a sense of deep caring. God is interested in us. God's heart is kind. And that's incredibly humbling, isn't it? You and I cannot be our own idea, despite what some people think. I had one man in this church tell me, "David, I'm a self-made man." I thought, boy, do you need some theological training and education. None of us are self-made. We're not our own idea. So whose idea are we, and what on earth are we living for? Well, if you walk by the Avon River in Stratford, you see little ducklings. They're fully engaged with life, aren't they? Mother sets sail and they all follow her in the water. Their lives are drenched in purpose. This is true for all animals. They've got this incredible will to live. Only when animals are caged or confined do we see them droop and fail to thrive. But release them, and purpose returns instantly. I once caught a groundhog, and I tried to domesticate it. It was a dull failure. He refused to eat anything. But when I opened the trapdoor, he took off with incredible, purposeful speed. He knew the difference between being confined and having freedom. I had an aunt in England who would rescue battery hens from their cages. Worn out through night and day egg-laying, their feathers falling out, they were incredibly miserable birds when she got them. But then she'd look after them and love them, give them a proper run, allowing them to scratch the ground, and they would recover. The feathers would start to come back. The curiosity would return, and they would begin to thrive. And lo and behold, these barren birds would begin to lay eggs again. You and I are free. We can treat each other well, or we can sink into the depths of depravity. We can nurture each other or destroy each other. God doesn't stop us from behaving badly or well. That, I put to you, is freedom. We're free not to believe in God either. We can decide to be atheists. We can argue that the universe is impersonal and uncaring about us. We can feel that we're alone in the planet and in space. We can teach survival of the fittest and dispense with morality. Oh yes, we're free, awesomely free. In the great Riverside Church in New York, William Sloane Coffin once cried out to God saying, "God, you're giving us too much freedom. We can't handle it." You ever feel like that? Wanting God to stop the train so he could get off, avoid all the suffering and death and the unraveled fabric of life with all of its short ends? Well, you're not alone. You see, if God is a loving God, why ever did God make us so free that we could end life on earth with nuclear war? Whatever could the purpose be for such freedom? What's it all about when you work it out, Alfie? When Hal David wrote What's It All About Alfie, he struck a chord of deep truth. The song goes, "As sure as there's a heaven above, Alfie, I know there's something much more. Something even non-believers can believe in. I believe in love, Alfie." Jesus taught us that life on this planet is all about love. But love can be very costly. You can love and lose your loved one. If you fall in love and the other person doesn't, you can't compel their affections. You can have your heart broken. Why? Because love has to be freely given. As the Beatles said, money can't buy you love, but they also said love is all you need. But for true love to exist, it needs absolute freedom. And that's why the planet is designed the way it is. Robert Frost, in his great poem, Birches, said, "Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go any better." So what would you change on Earth? How would you go about fixing it? Would you take away our awesome freedom for good or ill? And would Earth still be the right place for love? Personally, I've concluded that this world is the best possible world for its central purpose. I believe that we're here to make our souls, and there's no better place in the universe than the Earth for that purpose. Suffering can build character. Over the years, when I've asked the question, what on earth am I here for? The best, most powerful answer I have received is, we're here to be kind. You see, when we're kind, the whole world fills with meaning and hope and joy. When we love the Lord our God with all of our heart and mind and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves, life begins to fill with purpose. Being kind above all other things pleases the God who sees the sparrow fall and who asked us to love our neighbor and our enemy. Being kind to absolutely everyone can be hard at times, but overall, being kind makes life memorable and profoundly worth living. A number of years ago, a man called Kent Nurburn drove a cab for a living. One time he arrived in the middle of the night for a pickup at a building that was dark except for a single light in a ground floor window. He walked to the door and he knocked. "Just a minute," answered a frail, elderly voice. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman in her 80s stood before him. She was wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat with a veil pinned on it, like somebody out of a 1940s movie. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cupboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag out to the car?" she said. He took the suitcase to the cab and then returned to assist the woman. She took his arm and they walked slowly towards the cab. She kept thanking him for his kindness. "It's nothing," he said. "I just try to treat my passengers the way I would want my mother to be treated." "Oh, you're such a good boy," she said. When they got to the cab, she gave him an address and then asked, "Could you drive through the downtown?" "It's not the shortest way," he answered quickly. "Oh, I don't mind. I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to hospice." Looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "The doctor says I don't have very long." He quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like me to take?" he asked. "For the next 2 hours. They drove throughout the city. She showed him the building where she'd once worked as an elevator operator. They drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had him pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she'd gone dancing as a young girl. Sometimes she'd ask him to slow in front of a particular building or corner. She'd sit staring into the darkness, saying nothing. At the first hint of the sun creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "I'm tired. Let's go now." They drove in silence to the address given. It was a low building, like a small convalescent home, with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab as soon as they pulled up. They were solicitous and intent, watching her every move. They must have been expecting her. He opened the trunk and took the small suitcase to the door. The woman was already seated in the wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she said, reaching for her purse. "Nothing," he said. "You have to make a living," she answered. "There are other passengers." Almost without thinking, he bent down and gave her a hug. She held on to him tightly. "You gave an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." He squeezed her hand and then he walked away into the dim morning light. Behind him, a door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. He didn't pick up any more passengers on that shift. He drove and drove, lost in thought. For the rest of the day, he could hardly talk. On a quick review, Nerburn didn't think he'd done anything more important in his life than that. He says we're conditioned to think that our lives revolve around these great moments. The great moments often catch us unaware, beautifully wrapped in what others may consider a small. In this, I believe we're like God. As the old hymn says, there's a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. There's a kindness in God's justice, which is more than liberty. But we make God's love too narrow by false limits of our own, and we magnify its strictness with a zeal God will not own. For the love of God is broader than the measures of the mind, and the heart of the eternal is most wonderfully kind. What's it all about, Alfie? Is it just for the moment we live? What's it all about when you sort it out, Alfie? Are we meant to take more than we give, or are we meant to be kind?